Why American soldiers held the bridge when they knew no reinforcements were coming. A true story. The bridge was not beautiful. It was old, narrow, and built for farm carts, not for war. The wooden planks were wet from 3 days of rain. The iron railings had turned brown with rust. The river below it moved fast and dark, carrying broken branches and mud. There was nothing special about this bridge. But on a cold morning in the final year of World War II, it became the most important piece of wood and iron in the world to a small group of American soldiers. Their names were not famous. They were not generals or heroes from the newspapers. They were young men who had left their homes in small American towns, who had eaten their mother's cooking just a year before, and who now stood in the mud of a European countryside with rifles in their hands and fear in their chests. They were ordinary. That is what makes this story worth telling. Sergeant Thomas Whitfield was 31 years old, which made him the oldest man in the group. Back home in Tennessee, he had worked at a hardware store. He knew how to fix a roof and how to be patient. He had a calm face, the kind that did not change much whether he was reading a letter from his wife or watching enemy soldiers move through the trees. The men in his unit trusted him not because he was loud or impressive, but because he never pretended things were fine when they were not. Private First Class Eddie Marconi was 19. He was from Chicago, and he had never seen a farm in his life until he landed in Europe. He was thin, quick with a joke, and still had the habit of touching the small cross around his neck whenever things got quiet. He had joined the army because his older brother had joined, and his older brother had joined because their father said it was the right thing to do. Eddie had not yet decided for himself what the right thing was. He was still figuring that out. Corporal James Okafor was 24. He was a black soldier in an army that treated black soldiers differently, gave them worse equipment, put them in harder positions, and expected less from them while demanding more. James knew this and carried it quietly, the way a person carries a stone in their shoe for a long time. It hurts, but you learn to walk. He was one of the best soldiers in the unit, and he knew that too, and he let his work speak for him because the army had made it clear that his words would not be heard the same way. There were 11 of them in total. 11 men on a bridge at the edge of a small village, with orders that had come through the radio in the early hours of that morning. The orders were simple: hold the bridge. Do not let the enemy cross it. Do not destroy it. Keep it standing until Allied forces could use it to move men and supplies forward. Simple orders. But orders do not come with guarantees. Sergeant Whitfield gathered the men around him before the sun was fully up. The fog was thick, and the cold made everyone's breath visible, small white clouds appearing and disappearing in front of each face. He told them what he knew. The enemy was moving toward this area. Their job was to hold the position. Reinforcements were on the way. He said that last part carefully, without looking anyone in the eye. He had been told reinforcements were coming. He had not been told when. James Okafor stood at the back of the group and said nothing. He had heard enough radio conversations to understand what was not being said. He looked at the bridge, then at the trees on the other side of the river, then back at Whitfield. He gave a small nod. He was ready. Eddie Marconi raised his hand. "Sergeant, how long do we need to hold it?" Whitfield looked at him. "As long as it takes." Eddie put his hand down. He did not ask again. They spent the next 2 hours preparing. They moved sandbags to both ends of the bridge. They identified the best positions for cover. They checked their ammunition and shared what little extra they had. One soldier, a quiet young man named Kowalski from Ohio, had a small bag of hard candy in his jacket pocket. He passed it around without saying anything. Everyone took one. It was a small thing, but small things matter very much when large things are frightening. The first sounds came just before midday. It was not a roar or an explosion. It was something quieter and, in some ways, more frightening. It was movement in the trees. The sound of boots on wet leaves. The sound of men trying to be silent and not quite succeeding. Whitfield gave the signal. Everyone went still. Then the firing began. The story of a battle is always told afterward, in calm rooms, with maps and arrows showing who went where. But in the moment, there are no maps. There is noise, and there is smoke, and there is the very strong feeling that the world has become much too small. There is the weight of a rifle and the sound of your own heartbeat and the face of the man next to you, and that face is the most important thing in the world because if he stays, you stay. The enemy tried to push across the bridge twice in that first wave. Both times, the 11 men held them back. The bridge was narrow, which helped. You cannot send 100 men across a bridge that only fits 3 side by side. The soldiers used that fact well. They stayed at their positions. They did not run. They did not fall back. When the firing stopped, the silence that followed was very loud. Eddie Marconi sat behind a sandbag and looked at his hands. They were shaking. He had not noticed them shaking while the shooting was happening. Now he could not stop looking at them. James Okafor crawled over to him and sat next to him. "They'll come again," James said. "I know," Eddie said. "You did fine." Eddie looked at him. "I was so scared I forgot to be scared." James almost smiled. That's how it works. It was in the quiet after that first fight that Whitfield made a decision. He gathered the men together again. He spoke in a low, clear voice. "I have to tell you something," he said. "Reinforcements are not coming before dark. Maybe not tonight at all. Command is stretched thin. We are the only ones here. That is the truth." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then one of the younger soldiers, a boy named Patterson, who had grown up on a farm in Georgia, said, "So what do we do?" Whitfield looked at him. "That is what I am asking you." This surprised everyone. A sergeant does not usually ask. He tells. But Whitfield understood something that most people only learn after many years. When you ask a man to choose, and he chooses to stay, he becomes a different kind of soldier. He is no longer following an order. He is keeping a promise. And a promise is stronger than an order. One by one, the men spoke. Some said they would stay because of the people on the other side of the river, the villages, the families, who would be in the enemy's path if the bridge fell. Some said they would stay because of each other. Kowalski, the quiet one from Ohio, said only, "I'm not going anywhere." He said it as if he were refusing to leave a friend's house in the rain. James Okafor was the last to speak. He stood up straight and looked at the bridge for a long moment before he turned to the group. "This country has not always been good to me," he said. "And that is the truth, and I do not pretend otherwise. But the people on the other side of that water did not choose this war, and they do not deserve what comes if we leave. So I am not leaving. Not because I was told to stay. Because I decided to." There was no cheer. No dramatic moment. The men simply nodded, and went back to their positions, and waited. The second fight came in the late afternoon, when the light was turning orange and cold. This time the enemy came in larger numbers. They had clearly decided that this small group of soldiers was not going to simply go away on its own, and they were right. They pushed harder. They came from the tree line and from the left side of the river bank. They were organized and they were determined. The 11 men on the bridge became 10. And then 9. Whitfield took a wound to his left arm. He wrapped it himself with the cloth from his jacket and kept firing. He did not make a sound about the pain. He simply kept doing his job, because that was the kind of man he was. Eddie Marconi, who had been trembling just hours before, now moved with a steadiness that surprised even himself. When James Okafor's position was threatened from the right side, Eddie moved without being told, crawled across the wet planks of the bridge, and placed himself between the threat and his friend. He did not think about it. His body simply moved. Later, he would try to explain this to people back home and find that he could not. Some things cannot be explained. They can only be done. The fighting lasted nearly 2 hours. It felt much longer. The sun went down, and for a while everything was happening in the dark, in the noise, in the confusion that war makes of the world. And then, slowly, the pressure eased. The enemy pulled back. The firing became less frequent, then stopped. The bridge was still standing. They sat in the dark and waited. Nobody said much. There was not much left to say. The bridge was beneath them, solid and cold. The river moved under it as it always had, indifferent to everything that had just happened on its surface. Whitfield moved from man to man, checking on each one. He said a word to each of them. Not big words. Just enough. That is the thing about a true leader, he does not need a speech. He needs to be present. Eddie sat at the edge of the bridge with his legs hanging over the side, watching the dark water below. He was thinking about his brother, who was somewhere in the Pacific. He was thinking about his mother, who would be in the kitchen at this hour, probably not knowing that on the other side of the world, her youngest son had just done something he could not have imagined doing when he left home. James Okafor sat near the center of the bridge with his back against a post. His eyes were open, and he was looking at the stars beginning to appear above the fog. He was tired in a way that went past his body. But he was also, strangely, at peace. Not the peace of a man who is happy. The peace of a man who has done exactly what he believed was right. That is a very particular kind of quiet. It was past midnight when the sound of vehicles came from the road on their side of the river. Everyone reached for their rifles. Whitfield raised a hand. Wait. Then a voice called out from the dark, in American English, asking for the password. Whitfield gave it. There was movement, and headlights came slowly forward, and then there were other soldiers, many of them, coming down the road toward the bridge. An officer came forward. He was a major, older, with mud on his boots and an expression on his face that suggested he had seen many things and been surprised by very few of them. But when he reached the bridge and counted the men standing on it, he stopped. "You held this with 11 men," he said. "9 now, sir," Whitfield said. His voice was flat, not sad, just accurate. 2 men had been wounded badly enough to be unable to stand. The major looked at the bridge. He looked at the river. He looked at the dark tree line on the other side. He seemed to be calculating something in his head, some math that could not quite come out to an answer he understood. "You knew reinforcements weren't coming," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir." "And you stayed?" "Yes, sir." The major looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" Whitfield glanced back at his men, at Eddie, still sitting on the railing, and at James, now on his feet, and at Kowalski and Patterson and the others. He looked at them the way a person looks at something they are proud of but do not know how to describe. "Because someone had to, sir," he said. "And we were the ones who were here." The bridge was used by Allied forces for the next 4 days. Trucks crossed it, carrying supplies. Soldiers crossed it, moving forward. The advance continued, and the bridge was a part of that, a small but real part of something larger. The story of those 11 men did not appear in the newspapers right away. It was a small action, in a small place, during a very large war. There were bigger stories happening everywhere. That is how it is with the things that matter most, they are often happening in quiet places, away from the people who write the history. But the men who were there knew. And they carried it with them for the rest of their lives, not as a trophy or a story to impress people with, but as a private knowledge. The knowledge of what they had been willing to do, and what they had actually done. Eddie Marconi went home to Chicago and became a teacher. He taught high school history for 30 years. His students sometimes asked him if he had ever been in the war, and he always said yes, but he rarely gave details. When a student once asked him what it felt like to be brave, he was quiet for a long time before he answered. "I do not think I was brave," he said. "I think I was just with the right people. And that made me better than I would have been alone." James Okafor returned home to a country that was still figuring out what it believed about men like him. He lived long enough to see that change, slowly, imperfectly, but really. He never spoke much about the bridge. But his daughter, who became a history professor, found a letter he had written on the night before the battle, tucked inside an old Bible. In it, he had written, "I do not know what tomorrow brings. But I know who I am." That will have to be enough. It was enough. Thomas Whitfield went home to Tennessee and back to his hardware store. He was the same quiet man he had always been. He fixed roofs and helped his neighbors and came home to his wife for dinner every evening. People in his town knew he had been in the war, but he did not talk about it unless someone asked directly. And even then, he never made himself the center of the story. He would say, "There was a bridge. The men held it. I was fortunate to be among them." The bridge itself stood for many more years. Long after the war ended, it was replaced by a newer, stronger crossing. The old planks were taken down, and the iron railings were removed. Today, there is no sign that anything significant ever happened there. The river still moves, fast and dark, carrying branches and mud toward the sea. But somewhere, in letters and in diaries and in the quiet memories of old men who are mostly gone now, the story exists. 11 soldiers. 1 bridge. No reinforcements. And a decision, not given from above, not forced by any order, but made by ordinary people who looked at each other and decided that they were not going to leave. That is all it was. That is everything it was.